What is game? This is a question that has baffled many over centuries, citation needed, and yet the finest minds continue to be absorbed in grappling with this question, citation wanted. Join me in parking your vehicle without paying downtown during regular business hours and explore frequency, components, and their sum in this episode of the Branching PathCast. Citation issued. I'm Marley, and yes, the famous Idle Thumbs quote, "What is game?" remains as relevant today as it ever was. And as games continue to resist being rigidly defined, as all good art does, it can provide an interesting avenue leading into today's conversation to investigate what exactly is game. Of course, I will not reach a definition that satisfies many, but I would like to posit that games are a participatory process whereby others accept implicitly a contract to engage in a simulated world. I believe there are several key components that I would like to explore that are used in this framing of what a game is. And I will explore these aspects in relation to other things because I love to explore things via seeming non sequitur. First, I would like to explore the idea that things are separate, and I'd like to begin by recalling an old philosophical story, this being the ship of Theseus, who the eponymous Theseus is does not concern us. Rather, his ship is the main character of the story, and, as it were, this ship is currently docked. For this thought experiment, there is a process that is being undergone whereby the ship consists of discrete components, and every day exactly one section of the original ship is taken and replaced by a new piece, with the taken piece being used to construct a new second ship. This process continues until every single piece of the original ship has been replaced by new components, and a new ship has been assembled using the entirety of the previous ship parts. The questions begged are several. Firstly, which ship is the ship of Theseus? One or both? Neither? If the first ship is the ship of Theseus, what is the second ship, which is now entirely the same material in the same fashion? If the second ship is the ship of Theseus, when would it be considered to have become the ship, rather than the so-called original ship? It's an interesting thought experiment that I feel is effective in challenging identity and objects over time. It seems like it is insufficient to say that something is so based on their exact physical makeup. If this was a person who stepped inside a teleporter that broke them down and reconstructed them exactly using the same components in the same way, is that the same person? And what if a teleporter now broke down a person in the same way and created two individuals who were replicas of the original individual? Our experience of the world is tied to the bounding of things insofar as it is useful for us. And as there has been a cell recycling processes and the complicated dynamic alterations of the continuous physiological processes and experiential consequences, as well as fluctuating microbiota and the newly probed virobiota, there are a lot of alterations taking place across time. And this is our first clue that there is a continuity across spacetime that seems embedded in the continued identity of something. So although a person may alter greatly, there is a trajectory that can be observed. At what rate of change or continuity break does it sever the identity of the individual or object? The case often talked about, Phineas Gage, the poor soul whom received a railroad spike lobotomy due to an accident, was described as being a completely different person afterwards. In this occurrence, it happened relatively rapidly, destroying a part of himself. This is clearly different than losing an appendage, as behavior is linked deeply to an object. Form is function to a degree. However, not all form alterations result in equal resultant effect on function. So there is the idea that what makes something identifiable is linked more so to the function or behavior of the entity rather than the consistency of the form. There's also the idea of ownership that is linked to identity, which makes the ship of Theseus a bit less analogous when concerning persistence of identity in organisms. But using the name as merely an identifier, severed from the idea of ownership, it seems unsatisfying to view both ships as being instances of the ship of Theseus, and equally unsatisfying when viewing neither ship as being the ship of Theseus. And when does something become a ship at all? The new ship built Of old parts, I would say, becomes a ship when it gains the functionality of serving as a ship, which I would classify as being able to float atop the water and support a relatively reasonable mass. If this is the case, it would mean that in suffering a hull breach, a ship would cease to be a ship and only regain that identity when the ship is repaired. This too seems kind of strange, so perhaps there is a threshold of functionality that is required for something to gain a label, and yet the removal of that label cannot be as easily done. Once something becomes a ship by virtue of functionality that defines it, then the loss of that functionality is not necessarily sufficient to remove the label. If we accept this as a premise, then there is a point early on where the first ship remains a ship, while the second ship is not yet a ship, but is an object with the building potential to become a ship. Here, I feel it is convenient to consider the identity of something like a river. Another philosophical experiment that is favored in beginner philosophical classes is ruminating on the idea that you can never cross the same river twice. As the river is constantly in flux, it is ever changing. This can be true of all things, however, to a degree, and the rate at which things change is the difference. But a river is deemed to have an identity when it becomes sufficiently large, carving out a pathway through the land and running with sufficient continuity or frequency. But the river isn't just the water, it is also the space of the water and the riverbed, the ecosystem that makes up the water, and the many organisms and organic homeostatic mechanisms whereby the niche organisms and environment work to keep a kind of messy balance. What is the function of a river? A river merely runs, and although it may stop intermittently, it may maintain the label assigned to it as a specific river as long as it maintains sufficient periodicity and continuity. And when does something become a river for the first time? It is a matter of subjective degree, but the initial channeling out of a pathway whereby water comes to run through in sufficient quantity, whatever that may be, it may become a river due to the labeling of an observer. And if that river is diminished to the point that it ceases over time to no longer function as a river, then it will cease to be one. But there is a fuzzy support of the riverness and the maintaining of it that comes with the increasing river-like properties that help to both sustain and validate it as a river. So what does it mean when someone has become a different person? This is not tied to the notable physical absence of anything necessarily. The notion is applied to someone whom is subjectively viewed as remarkably and consistently altering their expected behavior or their way of functioning. So before I extrapolate on these things to game development and story, I suppose I should throw out my views on the ship of Theseus. Feel free to offer your own thoughts in the comments, of course. The ship of Theseus is always the first ship. This is because it maintains permanence across space-time. That is, it has a consistent history and maintains functionality. Despite the second ship being a replica built in the same way with the same components, it is a second ship. Does this change if the entire ship was constructed piece by piece with the previous ship, having in turn each piece replaced by a new piece over the course of a single day? I would say it does not, and we can take this to the extreme and wonder what the case is if this occurred impossibly over the course of the smallest possible unit of time. This would remove the idea that it happened piecemeal, and so it fundamentally changes things. And in this case, it also becomes a bit more difficult to see the first ship as the ship of Theseus, and the second as a new ship made of old parts. It's kind of hard to think of either ship as the ship of Theseus at this point, and I think when you collapse things to occur virtually instantaneously, neither is an appropriate stance, as this fundamentally severs both objects from the tether of consistent space-time tracking. It is severing it from identity. This is why, in the case of living organisms being teleported, even in the instance of exact components being reconstructed in the same way at a separate location, many consider the relatively instant reconstitution not to be the movement of an entity from one space to another, but the death of the original and the instantiation of a new organism who happens to have the same exact constituent parts organized in the same manner. The violation of our macroscopic experience destroys the identity of the entity. When there is a sequel or reproduction of a game or a movie, it is often done as the previous one was successful in some manner. I hope you can't hear the dog licking my foot. The components that make up the previous work are analyzed, and the goal is generally to iterate upon the parts of the original that made it special and unremarkable. There are many instances of derivative games that were designed around the same kinds of parts, in the same organization, and yet still faltered. They functioned differently. An eternity ago, I threw out that games are a participatory process whereby others accept implicitly a contract to engage in a simulated world. I feel I've explored the participatory process aspect well. There is a point whereby something becomes reorganized as a game, and that is the point where a player may engage in the simulation such that they are participating in the shifting process of the game world. And once a game violates that process, such as a bug that causes the introduction of the process, it does not cease to be a game. It becomes a broken game, a dried up river, a leaking boat, and the taking of old parts of an originally successful game or of the components of other games that are inspiring to make a new game is tricky, as the game is not a collection of parts that make it up, but the process that emerges as a consequence of the operation of those parts in relation to one another. Games as a fluid process rather than a concrete entity help to envision the dynamic, turbulent nature of them. And yet, there is an organization and stability to it that may make it easy to miss if you are not watching the river closely enough. There is organization at the root of chaos. A core loop is often talked about when game design is being considered, and importance placed on there being a focus on achieving a tight core loop overall. It is useful to think about the cyclical nature of things, as it seems somewhat inescapable that existence is in many ways a strange loop. As are we, even if you Gödel, Escher, balk at the notion. And I really haven't read that book, but the idea of the strange loop has been co-opted in my mind nonetheless. Things are nested, and if we are to consider games to be fluid systems, we can appreciate that they are merely processes made up of processes, and the makeup of these processes are defined by their component processes, some of which are relatively fluid, and some of which are relatively static. The collection of all these processes into a meaningful, larger process is useful. However, it can be viewed as a matter of practical scope. The tree structure that has come to dominate the organizational manner of things embodies this, with things being collections of other things, with the scope and boundary being the main demarcation. The cell is part of the body, is part of the ecosystem, is part of the region, is part of the earth. Or if you prefer, the character is part of the text file, is part of the folder, is part of the folder, is part of the folder. It would be absurd to prefer that in my eyes. So it is not enough to have the same processes operating with the same relational connectivity to spawn the same emergent function or behavior. And people don't really desire the same experience anyway. For an interesting exploration into what happens when this kind of thing is attempted, it is advised to check out the Salt Factory videos, specifically the reviews of Fable 1 versus Fable 2. How does one use this self-indulgent meandering to create a better game? Not by taking the components and linkages that worked for a prior experience and replicating or building upon them. Not necessarily. Identity is granted subjective function across time. And the function that a game has is kind of a messy thing to define in the perception of the player. But the function I will outline is, of course, a process to engage in. The absurdity of game genres is a consequence of the framing of them around functionality in terms of mechanics, rather than the functionality in terms of player experience. In a way, it makes more sense to me. The function of a game is to facilitate a participatory experience for the player or observer. This is more aligned with other kinds of media, which are described by their evocative nature. Granted, paintings may be made into sets based on their medium use, for example, but movies and books are conveyed as dramatic, horrific, and thrilling. These kinds of experiential framings are tied more so towards the function that they serve, which is to arise an expected subset of experiences. And perhaps this is a more useful lens than the somewhat limiting idea of a game being a looter shooter, three match, or walking simulator. A function of a game is not the mode or the mechanics. It is the emergent experience as a consequence of the interactions of the main systems that make it up, and the framing of games based on mechanistic classification during the design and development phase can constrain creativity and limit the exploration of things, drawing focus away from the true function of the game, the evocation possibility space. I think about framing a lot, as it seems like the influence that framing has on the process is large, and it is easy to let it fall into the background and let assumed things drift into the forefront. And because I am an anxious person, I am loath to consider what if. One of my most freeing alterations has been the prepending of so whenever I notice a thought like that. But in terms of game design, it is useful to challenge assumptions and explore different framings, which can open up the possibility of mixing up underlying components, or the way they interconnect. to refresh a sequel while maintaining the immersion experience. I hope that this has helped to stir in you some kind of inspiration. My aim is to hopefully help people to think of things a little differently. I'm not aiming to provide ways in which to improve or anything per se. Rather, I just want to shake things up and connect with some creative people who resonate with this kind of thing. Once again, I would like to thank Chanharu for manifesting this glorious ghostess. Please check out her Instagram linked below for more amazing artwork. I'm Marley, and if you would like more content, feel free to check out branchingpath.com. It is a great place to read blogs, contact, or work with me. And of course, it would make my day if you subscribe and like. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.